Learning how to color balance does not need to be difficult. It's actually pretty easy to do inside of DaVinci Resolve because we have 32-bit float and we have color space aware tools that were introduced actually as long ago as DaVinci Resolve 17, I believe. And the idea with the HDR Global tool, which is color space aware, is it takes the footage into what's called a perceptually uniform color space to do its math, so it works like our eyes perceive things. And it's also very similar to how the camera would do it if you had fixed it right from the start. But there's a lot of misconception on the idea that maybe you should need to use color management, or you should always use DaVinci Wide Gamut, which actually DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate can sometimes introduce more problems than it solves, especially on some footage. Cyan versus magenta, and then I go back to DaVinci Wide Gamut. The color cast is just, it's not as good. So I'm going to teach you how to work with it natively, the least amount of nodes, and how to get great results. In addition, I actually want to bust out my DaVinci Resolve micro panel so you can see how I would use the HDR Global wheel on that as well. So let's get started. The first thing to look at is your project settings. So the project level settings we're going to do is not color manage today. That's the little cog on the right to get to your project level settings, or Shift 9 will get you there too. Fourth thing down, color management. I'm going to use DaVinci YRGB, which says, hey, I'm in charge of doing any color changes. That's going to avoid having any issues you may have seen in the past with text colors changing from fusion level graphics and stuff, because when you're doing DaVinci YRGB, if you want to make a color change, you've done it on the color page, right? So it's not doing anything behind the scenes for you. The next thing along here is timeline color space. I have this set to Gamut 3 Cine, S-Log 3, and this is probably uncommon from many other tutorials you've seen. The idea behind this is when you're not working in color manage, which we're not working in color manage today, this is a default for color space aware tools. The HDR Global tool is a color space aware tool. So this is going to avoid us from having to set up extra controls on the tool. The idea is if you always shoot with the same camera and a lot of your timeline footage is the same, set this to whatever your camera shot, and then the tool is going to behave just as you'd want it to. I think this is a really smart way to work, and I don't see a lot of people doing this. So Gamut 3 Cine, S-Log 3 is what I would suggest here. If you that's assuming you shot with the Sony FX3 or FX30, blah, blah, blah. If you shot with something that looks normal and you don't know what it was probably Rec 709. And in that case, you just change your timeline color space here to the default that it came in when you opened Resolve the first time, and it would be Rec 709 scene. It's in here, the list. There it is. And then the other last important piece of this is your output color space should be Rec 709 scene. Don't set this to 2.4, please. 709 scene is 2.4, but it's going to look correctly when you export it. All that is set up good. Let's take a look at how we set up our scopes next so that we can properly, objectively evaluate the image. And the way I'm going to set up my scopes is, let's take a look at our window here. I'm going to give myself more room to start. So I'm going to close the gallery. If you're new to the color page, if you just click the highlighted window, it just temporarily goes away. You can always pull it back by clicking again. I'm going to close my gallery. I'm going to close my clips. I'm going to close my timeline just to give me more space. Now the scopes in here are fantastic. They're located down in the lower right there. If I click that little, looks like a heartbeat monitor, that's our scopes. And I need to see this larger because I'm interested in 4 different scopes today. So to expand this, see this larger, there's an expand button, or for your keyboard warriors out there, it's going to be Command-Shift-W. We'll pop that open. And the 4 scopes I'm interested in is 1 waveform and 3 different vector scopes. And as I open up the vector scopes, I'll explain why. So the first one is a waveform, which basically is going to allow me to evaluate the exposure objectively. But I don't like how it has colors on it, so I'm going to change it to Y only and turn off colorize. And then the next 3 are going to be 3 different vector scopes. And the way I'll change that so that this one is going to be vector scope 1. There's already vector scope here, and here's going to be my 3rd vector scope. I'm going to break these out so that rather than these all being the same, which would be pointless, is I'm going to break them out so that there's one that's looking at just the darker parts of the tonality, like the shadow range of saturation, one that's about the middle saturation values, and then the last one's going to be what's the brightest saturation values in the image. And this just really helps you sort of figure out where the balance should be, because sometimes you might not have something that's super bright that should be neutral, or maybe there's something that's super dark that shouldn't be neutral, and you can easily see into those ranges. The way it comes stock, though, is it's just looking at the overall image, so we're going to make some changes. The top one here, I want to look at the low part of the saturation, so I'll hit the settings to the right of where it says vector scope and just changes to where it says low. So low is now, this trace is what that white blob is called, is just giving me a readout on the darkest part of the region, or darkest part of the image. And then other than that, I would just turn off colorize, because if there's any big colors in it, I don't want to have colors in my scopes. This one over here, I'll hit the settings. This will be my midtones. Also turn off colorize, but this one I will turn on what's called skin tone indicator, which I'm not going to use in this tutorial today, but the idea is if I turn this on, you'll see a line appear right there, and you can balance an image easily just by placing skin somewhere along that line. And if it's in that general area, it's probably going to be pretty balanced. And then the last one is going to be for the high range. So the option, or the edit option next to the vector scope, I'll change this to high, turn off colorize. And one thing you'll notice, there's like tiny little dots on there. I always like to work with these zoomed in, like with the microscope, so I can really see what I'm looking at. And the way you get access to do that is you hold Option or Alt on your keyboard and then scroll into it. So since I don't have a mouse, I'm just using a Wacom tablet, I'm going to hold Alt or Option on my keyboard and use the wheel that's on the tablet itself. So Alt or Option, and this is giving me a punched in version of that Sony S-Log3 image there. So your cursor just needs to be over there, and that's going to give you a lot more to control to sort of see what's happening in the image. Now, the next thing, when you're using log footage, don't even bother doing any changes using any of these controls, lift, gamma, gain, offset, HDR Global, without first converting it to view it for the display that it's on. So this is S-Log3 footage. And so what I want to do is I want to convert this to Rec 709, and the way I'm going to do this is put it at the very end of my node tree. So I'm going to do everything camera native, Sony S-Gamma 3 Cine S-Log3, and then convert it at the very end of the node tree to 709. And I'll do that with the panel. So I'm going to just do add node, and then on this second node that popped up over here, the quickest way to add an effect, like a color space transform is the one I would go to for this, is hitting Shift Space on the keyboard, start typing it, color space transform, hit return, and then it just added it down there to the flow. Now you can't see the adjustment, so I actually need to open up my effects palette. I was trying to save space so you see everything large today. Input is how was the footage shot, and output is what am I viewing it on. And that's all you need to do. Input, since this was Sony S-Log3 S-Gamma 3 Cine, I'm just going to start typing SON, and that gets me down there pretty close. And same thing with input gamma. You'll find this out in metadata, or you'll have to ask the person that shot material. And then this is another thing that I see overcomplicated on YouTube, I guess I would say. Output color space for almost 99% of us is just going to be Rec 709. And then this one will also be Rec 709. And then you don't have to worry about the tone mapping settings. You don't worry about these OOTFs. That is in a great spot for us to start making adjustments. This output gamma set to 709 is correct. It's 709 2.4 with the... Anyways, the point is, this is what you want. I'm not going to get into that right now. To balance this, we're just going to do this in the node prior. So we're leaving everything native. I'm going to go previous node on my panel over there. And we're going to take a look at using the HDR Global to start balancing. Fixing balance with the HDR Global. Now, just so you know, HDR palette is not just for HDR footage. It's for perceptually uniform adjustments. So it works good with any footage, to be honest. You just have to make sure the tool knows what color space you're working in. And since we already set our project level color space up for Sony S-Log3, it already knows. We're good to go there. And the way you get to it, it's right next to the primaries wheels. It's right next. If you just click, it says HDR, and you don't have to be in HDR to work with it. The tool we're concerned with, and where you can do the bulk of all your work, is just this global control right here, this exposure, the temperature and tint. It all works photometrically like a camera works. But on the panel over here, if you want to use that rather than moving this global wheel around, you just make sure you hit the offset key on there. And the offset basically turns this into a temperature, tint, exposure for the rings, and then the trackball in there is the balance. So it's basically right there where my cursor is. And it's very intuitive when you have vector scopes up with using trackballs, because the image, the trace on here is basically telling you where you should move the image to. So if I'm going to hit reset, and I can see down here, the image is sort of sitting in this cyan blue range a little bit green. And this is the dark area, remember, because we set our vector scopes up, split based off of the different tonalities. So I'm just going to push this up here more towards the magenta, red, yellow range, And that's the exact direction I go with the trackball. So as far as using a panel, this is why it can be so intuitive. I'm trying to move that image so that it's sort of centered up on those vector scopes. And the idea is if it's completely centered on this crosshair, it has no color. It's desaturated. In other words, there's no color balance shifting in any direction, which makes it a perfect foundation for all your future color adjustments. So that's all I needed to do this image. If I hit disable, there's our before, it was sort of greenish, and now we've, put some color contrast back into the image. Now, to keep moving forward, if everything is in that same color space, this is the only setup you need. You need an output display transform, so a Sony S-Log to a 709, and you need to do your adjustments under the hood with your project level timeline color space setup. So let's move to the next clip. I'm going to copy this whole grade with the copy button on there. Go to the next clip. This one is also Sony S-Log 3, and it's terribly white balanced, and it's completely underexposed. Looks like it might be unusable. I'll hit paste, which will paste both my nodes that I had previously done. I'm going to hit reset, which is just going to reset the single node on the panel. And the first thing I need to think about is this is super, super dark. In fact, if you split out your tonalities in your vector scope, you see I see nothing in the high range at all. So this is another cue that maybe I need to increase exposure before I even do anything else. And I like to do it all in the same node. So I'm just going to increase exposure. And because the tool already knows I'm working in the correct color space, now we can actually see some of that yellowish, tint that was captured. And I just start moving that trackball for that global offset wherever it needs to go so that it is lining up. And this is the dark area, this is the highlight area, this is the midtone region. Maybe it's too bright, I bring the exposure back down. It's all in one tool, super, super fast. Hit disable, that's where it came from. Looks like yellow piss all over the place. And now it looks like it's something that's somewhat usable. Let's move forward. I will say copy this node, go to the next clip, which is one more Sony S-Log clip. I'll hit paste. And if you want to save these as a node tree so that first node is not always so messed up, you could certainly just save it like this and paste this down to the next shot. This is an example of an overexposed shot that because this is color space aware, this exposure tool is going to pull these clouds back. So that far right ring in offset mode on the micro color panel, pull that down. Then I can see there's still a color balance issue. Almost anytime you're shooting through glass, you're going to have some sort of color deal that you got to fix. And this was shot through the windshield of a vehicle driving down this super, super bumpy road. I can see it's kind of sitting too far to the green and cyan here. So I'm going to push the wheel towards this magenta red region. And I'm just moving one wheel to do that. And you can see pretty good results. Here's our before. And you want to do this fast. That's another point I want to get across. Your eye adjusts so quickly to this image that it starts looking good. And so the faster you can do it, the faster you'll be able to tell, did I make it better or not? Because if you didn't make it better, just leave it as it was. I would say this global wheel right here is one of the safest to do, especially as a beginner, to not mess your image up and make it worse. Now, what if it's not S-Log 3 footage? Let's look at the next clip. Another one that I shot through a glass pane. I was on the train on the way to Chicago. This is typical, right? Sometimes you get this really green and nasty looking bluish tint to something. It's completely fixable inside of DaVinci Resolve using the HDR Global tool. However, because I know this specific shot was not S-Log 3, because I shot it, it's Rec 709, what you want to do is you need to tell this tool that it's different from the working color space of the timeline. If you're just catching up or skipping ahead, I had set my timeline color working space to my main camera format. This could be a one-off shot that's not the same as the rest. So to do that, what you do is on the node that you're going to use the HDR tool, you come to this three-dot options menu, you come down to color space, and you tell the tool, hey, I'm actually not feeding you what the timeline base, you see that where that's coming from? It's coming from the project level setting. Instead, I'm going to give you some Rec 709 footage, and I'm going to give you the same Rec 709 for color space and gamma. Okay, so now when I make the adjustment, it knows where it came from, and it will operate in a very familiar way, I guess is what I would say. So to balance this shot, you can see it is so far off the vector scope, I don't even see anything in the highlight range, but I know there's some there because look at this. But to balance it, it's actually so simple. All in the offset, I'm just going to move my HDR Global up and up and up towards that red magenta area. And it took quite a ways to get there, but you have like almost all the infinite control that you might need to get all of that trace sitting in overlapping this crosshair, and it totally balanced the image out with, there was like nothing else I had to do. There's no lift, balance the gain and then go fix the lift, and then this balancing game is one control. So if I hit disable, that's where we came from. That's where we went. If you had tried to do this kind of a big move in DaVinci Wide Gamut on Rec 709 footage, it falls apart. And I will show you that in just a moment, but I want to just show you how easy this is to repeat on another shot. So let's go to the next clip. Another one that is more typical. It wasn't as bad, but it still has a major shift. Like look at this green that's in the highlights of this image right here. So again, this one's going to be a GoPro Rec 709 image that I'm feeding it. So if it's just a one-off, you just go to your 3-dot options menu, color space aware, change this here to Rec 709, and then Gamma will also be Rec 709. And then because it knows it's getting a Rec 709 image, I'm going to adjust the global control right here and move this so that this highlight crosshair is a little bit closer to overlapping. And I'm in offset. I'll start moving that trackball. And just a little move like that is all it needs. Now, this is what most color correction is. It's usually these small moves, but if you do these small moves correctly, it's going to get you rehired because this will make your footage look so much better. There is a disable version, enable. So it didn't even need that much. Maybe I move the black level blob more towards yellowish red. And we're putting more color contrast in the image. So you can see that sunrise peeking through, that if I had disabled, it wasn't tinted as much. You know, it's just a nicer looking image. And because it's Rec 709, I don't need that final transform at the end. So I just need one single node to do all this heavy lifting. Now let's fix a really poorly shot iPhone clip. So this next one here is from an iPhone 16 Pro Max, and you do need to know what color space shot the footage when you're shooting log with the iPhone. I'm going to take a look over here. If I go to the second node here, this one is from an iPhone 16 Pro Max, and that actually shoots Rec 2020 color in Apple Log. And if you're using the newer iPhones, the 17s, that one uses what's called Apple Log 2 color, believe it or not. And then the input gamma is Apple Log. So just be aware, you need to look that up in the settings so that you get that correct. But going out to 7 and 9 is the same either way. But it looks like this is not recoverable. This is not raw footage at all. This is just straight from the Blackmagic camera app. I think it was maybe ProRes, but either way, you think this is unusable. But it's fixable. All we need to do is we need to tell here on this node, this HDR controls, what color space to operate it in, and that's the 3-dot options menu. Change color space here is going to be Rec 2020, and then 3-dot options menu again. Gamma is going to be Apple Log, and check how easy it is to shift this into place. In fact, because this is more of a warms cools thing, you could try just using the temperature and tint controls here, which in offset mode on the microcolor, it's the ring here on the left is temperature tint or temperature. The middle one is tint. So I can see it's super, super blue. So if I want to start moving this towards warm, I can start getting there. Now, this is a limitation. When it's really, really off, you're going to run out of space. See, I'm at 4,000 on here. So you can finish it off using this global wheel that's in the center there. They're all kind of working together for the better good. But you can see I've got that center trace there on the dark part of the region, or dark part of the image is nice and black, colorless. And then the highlights, because I've split this out, vector scope is set to high on this one. The highlights are nice and neutral. Here's our before, there's our after. The final bit of this whole thing, and I'm sure you're wondering, why are we not just using DaVinci Wide Gamut? Well, the long story short is when you use DaVinci Wide Gamut, you apply an extra color conversion at the start of all your footage, and sometimes that can be damaging. In fact, it's putting what's called a 3x3 matrix on your footage. It's more nodes. It can be more damaging. So let me show you how that would actually affect this shot that was from the Canon G7X shot of the skyline of Chicago. So I'll change this to my HDR balance in DaVinci Wide Gamut. So this is going to be a common setup that you've probably seen before. The first node is going Rec 709 into DaVinci Wide Gamut. The last node is going DaVinci Wide Gamut into Rec 709, and then you do all your grading sort of in between here. So the idea of how you work with the HDR color wheels in this sense is you set your timeline working space to DaVinci Wide Gamut, and I'll show you how I've done that here. So media pool, rather than it being at the project level, I've set this one uniquely, and you can tell it's unique because it has this gear switch on the timeline. If I right click on it, go to timeline settings, color tab, you can see I've unchecked use project settings. So this time I'm saying timeline color space is DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. So everything should be working fine, but the tool just doesn't behave as nice, in my opinion. So the idea here is this is already using color space aware, use timeline because the timeline was set to DaVinci Wide Gamut. Let's see if we can get this balanced as good as we could when we did it native. I'm going to take my offset, my HDR Global, start moving that up towards we get to neutral, and I want you to see how different. There's my shadow range, and the trace, we'll move this up here, the trace of the highlight range is still sitting there down there, super cyan. So I balanced part of the image, but not the other. So here, if I disable this, yeah, it was a huge improvement. But if I try to move it so that my highlights in the vector scope, all of my shadow range is all super magenta now. So it's like I get the highlights looking good or I get the shadows looking good. But part of the reason this happens is because we've taken something that was in a specific set of colors, we sent it way out far and tried to make adjustments on that, and that's not always going to give you the best results. The best results are when you do the least manipulation to the image. And so that's why I think working and balancing in a native color space is always going to give you the best result. Quick comparison. So this, you can see the shadow range is basically centered here. Let's take a look at the one balanced in native. And there's a pretty big difference here. See, we've got the trace, is not going to lie. It's basically, we're in that center range there. So we're not so, and cyan versus magenta. And then I go back to DaVinci Wide Gamut. The color cast is just, it's not as good. So this is my big suggestion, especially for anyone just starting out. Leave the colors alone. Pick the timeline working space to be whatever the most of what you shot was. And then you don't even have to worry about coming to this 3-dot options menu unless you have that one-off shot that's going to work differently. My name is Chadwick. This channel is called Creative Video Tips, where I teach all things about DaVinci Resolve. I'm a master trainer, but more importantly, I just want to make sure that you know how to get the best results out of this incredible tool. And because there's so much more to learn, I'll see you in the next video.